This is the Monday Call, brought to you by NZ Funds.
Welcome to the Monday Call. I'm Stefan Clark, Chief Client Officer at NZ Funds, and I'm joined by James Grigor, Chief Investment Officer. During his time leading the Wallabies, Nick Farr-Jones was the All Blacks' greatest adversary. Nick famously captained Australia to victory in 1991. Since retiring from the game, Nick has had an illustrious career in finance and law, specialising in the mining and commodity sectors, and is a prominent community leader in New South Wales. We recently had the privilege of hosting Nick for a series of investment briefings throughout New Zealand. The focus of our conversations was on what Nick learned about leadership over the past 30 years at the very highest levels of sport and business. This week's Monday Call is a chance for a wider audience to hear from Nick. He'll share his observations on leadership and team cultures in business and sport, as well as the current state of world rugby. We'll also discuss his role at Taurus Funds Management, which specialises in financing mining projects. And we'll talk about the shape of the mining and commodity sectors as the world begins its journey towards a decarbonised future. This is a great opportunity to hear from Australia's rugby royalty and a leading voice in the Australian mining industry. Nick, welcome. It's great to see you again, and thank you very much for joining.
Great to see you, Stefan, and lovely to meet you, James. Stefan, I'm just going to quickly pull you up. I had a week with you on our road trip in New Zealand, and I thought I'd lectured to you enough about my background, because you did say in that introduction, that very kind introduction, after a career in rugby. I just wanted to remind you that I didn't have a career in rugby. Well, I did, and I was either a law student at Sydney University or I worked in a mid-sized legal practice as I played rugby, because, as I said, I didn't have a professional career. I was lucky enough to be an amateur in the 10 years that I pulled on that gold jersey. So I just thought I'd quickly pull you up again. I thought in that week we were on the road that you might have remembered.
Thank you, Nick. It's good to be accurate. Look,
can I ask a question right on that? Would you have rather have been in the professional era, or are you glad you were in the amateur area? Because then I guess you had to focus on your studies, didn't you?
Yeah, no, James, you're exactly right. And, I'd love to have $1 for every time someone said, Nick, what did you do after rugby? Assuming that you played professional rugby, because the game went professional as it should have, and it needed to in 1996. It was after the 95 World Cup. And there was a lot of agitating. And to be honest, I was one of those agitators after we won in 91. I came back and, one of the big sports entertainment groups was IMG, International Management Group, and they now manage the Rugby World Cup for World Rugby. And so they organise all the broadcasting rights, they organise all the sponsorship and what have you. But I approached IMG, a chap called James Erskine, in 92 after the World Cup. And my concern was that whilst I had a job, and I was very fortunate to be paid whilst on tour, there was a bunch of my colleagues, my teammates that may have had young kids that had a mortgage, and they weren't being paid. And you could go away for some time. I mean, in the 10 years that I played, you've got to remember too, for your audience, you've got to go back to the amateur days when we really only played on average 7 or 8 tests a year. We didn't have time to play 14 tests as they do now, and they need to pay those 14 tests to get the recurrent income that generates the funds to support professional rugby. So to answer your question, I've said many times that I actually think I was the last of the lucky ones, and that's for many reasons, that I was the last of the amateurs. As I mentioned on the trip with Stefan, to our audiences, across New Zealand, for many reasons. One, in 1984, when I first went on a Wallaby tour, we went away for 10 weeks. We went and played 18 matches. You got out of the major cities. And to me, that was a really special part of rugby touring. Nowadays, they go, your All Blacks and our Wallabies will go on their spring tour shortly. And they'll just go to London, maybe, Edinburgh, Dublin, Cardiff, maybe across to Paris. They only go to the cities. They play in the major stadiums. The dog barks, the caravan moves on. As I mentioned also, the 65 tests I was lucky enough to play, and I only played one night game. Why is that important? Because I'm a huge believer in a great French expression called le troisième mi-temps, which translates to the third half. And, nowadays when you're finishing your test match at 9 o'clock and, if you go to a press conference, you're not finishing till 10:30, you don't get a chance to break bread with the opposition, to have a beer in their changing room, or, as we often did, have an after-match dinner. And to me, that was really special. So, when I go to Paris in 2 weeks' time for an event and then across to London, I'll catch up with old mates, and I've got so many great All Black friends. I just dropped Foxy a note, as we always do, when Ryan just won the Dunhill. There's so many great All Black mates that I've got from those days, and I count it because we were breaking bread. We're having beers after the 2:40 minutes when it's damn the torpedoes full speed ahead.
2 p.m. kick-off, 2:40 minutes, and then a dinner to make friends with the opposition. Sounds great.
Yeah, that's the third half. And James, the other thing is that, when I finally decided in '93 that, I'd done everything I wanted to. I had 2 young kids at the time. I wanted to get more focused on professional life. I was a lawyer in a mid-sized legal firm, but I decided to stop on my terms. And the fact that I did exactly the same when I played rugby, I'd wake up early, I'd put on a suit, I'd jump on the train, I'd come to the city. That's what I did when I played rugby. We didn't train all day. We trained after hours at 6 o'clock. And so life didn't change, and you're well equipped, you're well trained for life after sport.
How do you think Australia went in this Bledisloe Cup? Tackle the elephant in the room.
Stefan, I thought in that first match, we're as good as I've seen Australia for some time, and I was amazed to see how Foley did, having not played for Australia for a number of years. I didn't expect him to play as well. Of course, the blunder at the end, which was tragic for our team, because we should have won that game, and what a comeback. You guys don't often get 20 points in front and surrender a lead, as you did in that first test. So there were green shoots as far as I was concerned. Of course, we've got a World Cup starting in a year's time in France, or in 11 months to be accurate. And I was seeing great shoots. Your audience would know Dave Rennie. I got to know Dave Rennie because of some of my involvement with New Zealand International Rugby Academy that Murray Megstead set up nearly 20 years ago. And Dave Rennie ran that for 6 or 7 years. He's terrific with young people. And, I've got to know Dave quite well as well, since he's taken on the Australian captaincy. So I was quite chuffed the way we were progressing and bringing through new players, and there was a good balance between some experience and youth. But then we get to Eden Park, the bogey ground. And again, we just got blown away. We played terribly. We made a million mistakes. You guys dominated. And sadly, I've still got that record of being a part of the 86 team. It was the last time we won it at Eden Park in Auckland.
Yeah. And obviously we were proud of that outcome, but we've had the ABs have copped a fair amount of criticism recently, and how they're preparing for games and coaching. How do you think about the relationship between coach and captain, and how's that changed?
Yeah, look, I've always, because I have been a professional for, sort of 35 years of my life, a lawyer, then an investment bank with a French investment bank, and now in private equity. As you said, Stefan, in introducing me, for 27, 28 years I've been involved in financing the global mining industry. But look, I very much compared when I took over the captaincy of the Wallabies in 1988 as a 26-year-old, and my then national coach was Bob Dwyer. Bob and I, we didn't come from similar backgrounds. Bob was a Randwick man. I was a Sydney University man. As far as our clubs, I really didn't know Bob for some strange reason. He didn't even speak to me before he made me captain. I was overseas in Europe, and I got a phone call from my mother-in-law, of all people, to say, I've just listened to the midday news and you've been announced as captain of the Wallabies. That was April 1988. So it was very strange. But to get back to your question, I mean, I very much saw coach captaincy as a chairman of a board, and the chief executive. And you're not there to agree, of course. Chairman's up there to just rubber stamp chief executive's decisions. They're there to interrogate it along with the other non-executive directors. They're there to ask questions, to look at the vision, to look at the particular goals for any given period, and to interrogate the execution plan. And Bob and I, we would often debate, we would often argue. We didn't do it in front of the team at training, albeit, we might know that we weren't in agreement. We'd do it typically behind closed doors, but we'd always make sure we got on the same page. And, that's why I think it's very much like chairman, chief executive. And, Bob and I have got a great relationship with this today. He's, nearly 82 years of age, I think. And, we see a lot of each other. Our wives get on well. And it's lovely memories from, and we just celebrated our 30 years. Sadly, it wasn't really celebration, 30 years since winning the World Cup because of COVID, so we couldn't have a team reunion.
When obviously when you took up the captaincy and ultimately led the Wallabies to incredible success, a lot of change needed to be brought through into the team to get to that point. Can you talk about what how you approached that and what you learned in preparing a team to get ready for something like that?
Yeah, look, there was a lot, Stefan, and if you don't mind me being a touch long-winded, I think some of your viewers will find it interesting, and I've certainly learned a lot from sport and what we had to do to change the culture of the team, to go on to be a very consistent team, because I suppose to cut to the chase, the first 2 years that I captained the Wallabies, 88, 89, we were very inconsistent. Business is about consistency, it's about individual and team consistency and performance. You don't want one great year and then one lousy year in business, nor do your shareholders. You don't want one great game, and you talked about the inconsistency this year of the All Blacks. I mean, who would have believed that they could be so good one week and so lousy the next week? When I played 20 tests against New Zealand, and sometimes I can seriously remember being able to count the number of mistakes they made in 80 minutes on one hand. Sometimes it was literally 2 or 3 mistakes, a turnover, maybe 1 or 2 drop balls. And that's the thing that surprised me about this current crop of All Blacks, the number of mistakes they're making. And that's why teams sense that they've got a chance against this All Black team. But getting back to the inconsistency that we experienced, 88, 89, we had a very consistent series against the All Blacks when you guys toured for 6 weeks and the typical 3 tests every 4 years, or every 2 years, but every 4 years in Australia. So we had 2 lousy matches in Sydney. We played at the unloved inner western ground called Concord Oval for 2 years, and those matches were there. Sean Fitzpatrick had just taken over as skipper. We had a great game at Ballymore in Queensland. In 89, if I've got any regrets, 30 years into retirement, it's that we didn't win that British Lions series. A great game at Sydney Football Stadium, beating the Lions 4-0. Went up and physically got bashed up at Ballymore, lost by, I think, 6 points. And then in the decider, some of your viewers might remember, albeit you probably weren't watching too much of the Wallabies back then, but the great David Campese with a few minutes to go and we were leading by a couple of points, got the ball behind our line, and the obvious thing to do was kick it out on the full. We defend the next couple of minutes. But Campo, and I rate him as arguably the best player I ever played with. He decided, he was going to go up upfield, and he had this attitude, never die wondering, if I could beat the tackle. And to cut to the chase, he threw a pass that wasn't expected, and they scored, and we lost that series. So very inconsistent. And then at the end of the 89 year, we went on Tour de France. Great victory at Strasbourg, up on the German border, beating, we had a very young team, beating the French by about 30 points. And 7 days later, we're about to become the first Wallaby team to win a series on French soil, played like busted bums and lost by a few points. And so drew the series. And, as I mentioned on our road trip, Stefan, Bob Dwyer, Michael Lona, my vice captain, Bob Templeton, the assistant coach, we went away for a weekend to try and focus on the inconsistency. And we focused particularly on that French tour and why could we be so good at Strasbourg and then in the second test so hopeless. And to cut to the chase very quickly, you might think that we were just complacent. We just expected the victory to come. We just thought we had to strut our stuff and, we would become that first Wallaby team to win a series on French soil. But sort of 3 days later, we concluded it was quite the opposite. We were too desperate to win. Every time we got the ball, we were trying to get the scoreboard moving. And we decided, let's try and change the culture of this team that was scoreboard focused to a team of what we called process driven. And, you might ask, well, what's process in rugby? And of course, it goes way beyond the 80 minutes. It goes everything you do in preparation, individually and collectively. Everything, preparation physically, but also the blood, sweat and tears that goes into the preparation of style of combinations of getting scrums right, line-outs right, combinations in backlines, all those things that go into properly preparing the stuff, your structure stuff. Did we change the culture overnight? No, it probably took us 6 or 7 months, but the last 25 tests that I played in the early 90s, we won 22 of those tests. We became a hugely consistent team that went on to win that World Cup. And then in 92, we beat you guys in a terrific Bledisloe Cup series. And of course, New Zealand and Australia jointly toured South Africa. They weren't a part of the 91 World Cup. Mandela had been released in 90, and the African National Congress supported a joint tour by the All Blacks and the Wallabies, and we both went over there. You guys played the first test at Ellis Park. We played the second test. But down in Cape Town in Newlands, we beat them by record scores. So it wasn't just winning the World Cup and having a fantastic 1991 year. It was going on to defend our mantle as the best team in the world. And I really put it down to understanding process, getting the process right individually and collectively, and the scoreboard looks after itself. And very much from a business perspective, I've tried to apply that. I work in the mining finance industry and the banking industry. I didn't study economics or commerce at school, but I knew that I could play a role. And if I surrounded myself with people that did stuff that I didn't do well, I could be originator, as we called it, the finder and the minder. But I needed people around me who were the binders and the grinders as well. So if I can do a good role of originating deals, of keeping the clients and minding the clients, but of course I need the people around me who do the financial modelling. Of course I need the people around me who love sitting behind a computer and writing the 30, 40, 50-page credit paper. Of course I need the geologists, that understand the rocks and the mineralisation and the important due diligence that goes into that vis-a-vis mining projects, and the metallurgists that go into the processing of the rocks to extract the gold or the zinc or the lead or the nickel, or the marketing that goes into coal or iron ore and all the various specifications, and the engineers that are required for the building of plants. So it is very much process, what I do for a day job, very much like I learned in rugby or in sport. Get the process right, the scoreboard looks after itself.
Nick, I've almost got, not almost, I've got goosebumps when you talk like that, because I think what for me that really clearly states is, in the end, sport, rugby, whatever sport it is, it's decisions that are made at the moment, and it's down to an individual and their performance, and really that's whether that's gut feeling, whether that's their skill set after practicing for 10 years doing it, or whatever it is. But if you can make that part of it such a small part of the outcome, and everything else is process driven, and it really reminds me of investing. In the end, it's a gut feeling. After all these models that we build and research that we do, if you want to buy company X and with the expectation that it generates a return, that is all backed up by process. But in the end, it's that sort of personal decision making at the end that you can be wrong or right, but you can reduce the times that you're wrong by having that process. I guess the question I have.
Yeah, James, you're very right. I mean, if I could just go into that. I mean, you talked about the research and all the various people you have, that go into the research and the sector and the individual company, and then you look at the balance sheet and you look at the forecasts going forward that are going to impact, their forecasts. For us, it's production, it's operating costs, it's all in sustaining costs in the mining industry. But you're dead right about the judgment at the end of the day. You individually have to make the call, and just as a scrum half and a captain of the rugby team, my judgment was critical. That's why when people say, Nick, the obvious thing that you have to have as a scrum half is a lightning fast pass off the deck, accuracy of the pass, great communication with your number 10, all the things that go into my game, my defensive game, my organisation. But one thing they forget about is how important my lateral vision is, because that impacts my judgment. And if I've got huge confidence, then my lateral vision is 270 degrees. If I lose my confidence, all of a sudden it might be 180. I need to know where the black jerseys are and where the gold jerseys are, because that defines where space is and my judgment. My judgment's got to be right 95% of the time, 9.5 times out of 10, because I often get first use of possession. So that gut feeling spontaneously is really critical, but it's backed up by hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of hours of individual training and collective training with my team that forms the foundation.
So how do you grind? Process is a grind, though. I mean, it's...
yeah, no, there's no doubt
so
about that, but that's what I was good at.
How do you get buy-in from junior members of the team, both professionally and in rugby, to have them understand that process will help them better
because
their judgment.
you lead by example. You lead by example, James. I mean, I was a kid who grew up swimming twice a day when I was young. So for 6 or 7 days, I swam competitively. I won state titles just across at North Sydney, across the harbour here. Then I was 3 hours on a train when my parents put a straw hat on my head, a boater, and put me on a train. So 9 minutes to get to school and 9 minutes to get home. So the swimming went, but I became a middle distance runner. I ran 800s, 1500s and 3000s. And those two disciplines held me in really good stead to go on from a kid who wasn't good enough to play first 15 in his school to then go on to have a decade with the Wallabies from the age of 22 and captain the team for half that period. So to answer your question, I think when the young guys came into the team, if their captain and leader and the senior guys in the team were prepared to do the blood, sweat and tears, well, then they'd follow suit. They quickly realised that if they wanted to pull on a gold jersey, there was some pain to be experienced. I mean, my first coach, Alan Jones, I'll always remember, him telling us the true story, on the 84 tour, which became our only Grand Slam tour when we beat England, Ireland, Wales and Scotland in that order. And they were my first 4 tests. But when he sensed the team was whinging about a very cold Welsh morning leading into the Welsh test match, he plonked us on the ground. Jones always had an analogy for a message he was trying to get across. And that morning, and it goes very much into this thing of process, he spoke about a young 17-year-old Italian boy whose surname was Gucci. And he was approached by his old man. His dad said, "Son, you're close to 18. What do you want to do with your life? I'm interested to know what you'd like to do." And he said, "Dad, I want to go into the clothing industry." And the old man's response was, "Well, here in Italy, everyone's in clothing, you won't be able to compete." And the boy supposedly said, "Dad, I know that, but what I want to do is get the best of everything. I want to get the best fabrics. I want to get the best designers and the best manufacturers. I want to produce a fantastic garment that people will want to buy." And the old man said, "Well, son, if you're going to do that, you're going to have to charge the top price. People won't be able to afford your gear." And the boy's response was the message that Jones was getting across, certainly the young 22-year-old. The boy said, "Dad, long after the price is forgotten, the quality remains." And that was very much a part of the culture that we built into the team. We had a lot of young guys that came in after the Lions series, and this goes back to Stefan's question about how do we turn around the team to go into the early 90s and become a very consistent team. And it's not only that thing of changing the culture, it was very much changing the jigsaw puzzle of the team. And so Bob Dwyer knew that we had to put some more starch in the pack. We got beaten up at Ballymore by the Lions, but he also knew that there were a lot of really good young players that we could bring into the team with the foundational members. And so you've got to remember, when Tim Warren and Jason Little came into the team in 1989, at the age of 19, they weren't playing for Queensland. When Phil Kearns came into the Australian team, again at the age of, in 1989 as well, he wasn't playing for Randwick Firsts. Eddie Jones was. And yet, Dwyer had the foresight to pick those two guys. Willie Offham-Gower came into the team. There was Tony Daly and Ewan McKenzie, as well as Phil Kearns in the front row that came in around about that time, 89, 90, 19 and 20-year-olds. John Eales came in 91 as a 20-year-old. So the jigsaw changed dramatically, but the young guys saw the way the old guys worked. People often say about David Campese, he was just a natural talent. He was a phenomenal player. Campese was one of the hardest workers I ever saw, as a winger. We had the great Simon Poyton, one of the toughest, hardest workers. You guys had them in, sways in the 80s and the 90s as well, but that was very much a part of setting the template for the young guys to watch, and they knew they wanted to stay a part of the team. They had to commit, and it was about very much commitment. This was the pig in the bacon and eggs. Absolutely process, not the chook who's just involved.
Do you think that as the process in a team or a business, as the senior guys leading by example are developing the process and are probably a little bit further on than just, coming up with a concept. That is kind of the pinnacle of that team. And once it's already established and then new people come and try and drive that process forward, leaders change, you retire, you've got new people to take forward that process. Is that perhaps when things start to come off the boil because you don't have ownership of that process because you didn't develop it in the first place? And perhaps that's what's happening in the All Blacks at the moment.
Yeah, look, it could be very much. I mean, leadership is critically important, and it doesn't have to be the guy who's got the C next to his name. I attribute our success in the '91 World Cup, and I'm sure John Eales would say the same about our '99 success, that both those teams were surrounded by leaders. There would have been 4 or 5 guys in our '91 team that gave me great support. People like Michael Liner, who I played over 50 tests with as my number 10, who was often my eyes and ears, and we had a great communication. As I mentioned, Simon Poydov and Rod McCall, those sort of people were critical. And the best teams have a number of leaders that support each other and what have you. Interesting what you say about the young people as they come through. I mean, hopefully they've been well mentored, that they look to take the baton and continue to look for ways to improve and to continually get better. And I mentioned the hard work, James. I think it's really important in leadership as well to create a balance in life. When we call it the on-off button, particularly tour, when it's on, do whatever it takes to prepare to strut your stuff in the 80 minutes. But make sure you turn it on off. Make sure you switch it on to off so that you get balance, you can enjoy each other's company. We only had one rule, particularly on tour: don't do anything when it's on off, that when you come to switch it back on at say 7:30 or 8 in the morning, that it's going to impact your performance in preparation. And sometimes I think businesses in particular go way overboard in not having that balance. I mean, my daughter worked for one of the big American investment banks for 4 years. She studied commerce and law at Sydney University, and I won't mention the name, but 3 years in Sydney, 1 year in New York. I promise you guys, she would get home on average at 2 to 3 a.m. in the morning when she was with us, and she'd be up again at 7:30 to get back to work. She was just dumped at sort of 7 and 8 o'clock, a whole bunch of assignments. There were pitch presentations to make to clients the next morning, and my daughter is a perfectionist, and so she would just stay there until it was absolutely perfect. I mean, that's no way to bring on young people. You've got to have a balance, and you can't work people 110, 120 hours a week. So she quickly left, and she's now in one of the major hedge funds just upstairs from where our building is down at Circular Quay. So you've got to get a very fine balance, and a part of culture is making sure that people have a bit of fun and enjoyment in doing, because they then can, as they grow up and take on leadership, they remember that, and you just don't dump people on young people. Yes, you work hard when you're young, and you've got to show the leaders and the bosses that you're prepared to roll up your sleeves, but you've got to make sure you have a balance in all this thing. I'm a stickler for those sort of things. You've got to have fun doing what you do, otherwise people burn out.
One of the things, I mean, is with process, people sometimes think it becomes mechanical. But what you've obviously done well, and maybe your story around Campese can sort of talk to this, which is create space for them to, show their flair, show their talent, and in turn succeed.
Yeah, well, Stefan, you might recall that a couple of times on our road trip that I did mention it, because I'm a huge believer in, as I said, the hard work, what we call the Gucci factor. I'm a huge believer in getting the process right. But one of the other things I believe is create an environment as a leader that allows people to occasionally make a mistake. As I said, if you make too many mistakes, and hopefully you learn from it, particularly in business. My daughter just recently had a fraud where it would have almost been impossible in the Know Your Client and a sort of due diligence to have been able to pick up on that. But, she had this fraud, and it cost them a fair bit of money. And the boss, because I see him a bit, we're in the same building, he said, look, that's okay, it's fine, Jess will learn from that. She was devastated, she was distraught, but she'll learn from it, and that's the important thing. You make a mistake, you pick yourself up, you dust yourself off, and you learn from it, and you become a better investor or a better rugby player. And you mentioned the Campo incident, and I mentioned it earlier that, with a couple of minutes to go against the Lions, he made mistake that the journalists said after the game, it should cost him his jersey. You know, even the great Andrew Slack, who was my first Wallaby captain, he captained us on that Grand Slam tour. He was a journalist, and he came out publicly and said, you can't pick him again. You know, Dwyer can't pick him. He's too much of a liability. And this grew and grew and grew. And I think it was the Thursday after the Saturday Test match as a young captain. You know, as I said, I played with David many times. I knew how good he was, and I came out and defended him. And, you know, it's in the biography that Peter Fitzsimons wrote about me. But basically, I wrote a public letter, which was published in you know, Eastern Seaboard papers, and it was in defence of David. And I basically said, look, Campo, you made a mistake on the weekend, but it didn't cost us the game. You know, we had 79 minutes in which to win that game. And I said, you'll learn from your mistake, there's no doubt about that. But I went on to say that, Campo, if I was selecting the team tomorrow, you would be the first player I'd select. And without shackles, if Bob Dwyer had said, Campo, I'm going to give you another chance, but thou shalt kick out on the full in your 22, you would have destroyed the essence of what David was about. As I said, he was never going to die wondering. And I think a really important thing, particularly, you know, leaders encouraging young people in life, across all facets of life, is allow them to walk the tightrope in life. You know, if you walk the tightrope in life, you're going to occasionally fall off. That is a natural thing, but learn from your mistake, become a better investor, become a better sports person, become a better musician. Whatever your trade is, become a better person from your mistake. And I think I was vindicated in 91 when we went on to win the World Cup. I'm sure some of your older viewers will never forget Campo's game against the All Blacks at Lansdowne Nut Road in Dublin. You know, he was phenomenal. That first try broke all the rules, all Bob Dwyer's rules, running exactly across field. I knew his voice and where I had to hit him with a drifting pass. You know, he ran past 6 All Blacks, including Fitzpatrick, who was seagulling on the wing and scored in the corner. And then who'll ever forget the ball over the shoulder as he bamboozled the All Black defence in and out, and then to Tim Horan, who went on to score. And you know, I think not just me saying how good he was. At the end of Rugby World Cups every 4 years, all the journalists who cover, so the print, the television, the radio, they all vote on the player of the tournament. And back in 91, there were about 150 journalists who covered the World Cup. It was unanimous. Campese was the player of the tournament. It's amazing to think about, you know, that could be a winger. And yes, had you guys won in 95, 4 years later, probably another winger would have won it. You know, of course, Jonah, the great Jonah. But for Campo to win it as a winger and unanimously, you know, declared as the player of the tournament was certainly vindication from my view back in 89.
Let's talk a bit about Taurus and what you're spending your time focused on at the moment. Can you tell us a little bit about the business and where it invests and how you even came there?
Yeah, well, so after law, which stopped for me just about the time I retired, I mean, life got out of control in a good way, so I stood down for 6 months, probably realising I wouldn't go back to law. One of my clients at the firm was the French investment bank Société Générale, and I got to know a guy who was passionate about rugby who ended up heading up the global commodity derivatives team, so oil and gas, but also very much precious metals and base metals. And he knew my sort of connection with South Africa, which back then was the biggest gold producer. He probably saw me as someone who was connected there. He wanted to start to open up, particularly South Africa, as a mining jurisdiction for the bank, and so he employed me in Paris, and we had 4 years over in Paris. I formed a joint venture with Rand Refinery. Back then it was the biggest gold refinery in the world. It had a capacity of 1,000 tonnes because of the days of the Witwatersrand Basin back in the 70s and 80s. We ended up completing the loop, and I opened a physical gold desk in Paris, and we ended up selling refined bars up in India. And so that was a really interesting thing. But at the same time, I also was very much a part of setting up the project finance team in London. I realised that as a bank, we did infrastructure and project finance, but we didn't have a focus on mining. And that was costing us some deals. And we realised the head of the project finance team up in Paris was also an Australian. And we needed to have, you know, in mining, there's a lot of complexity, there's a lot of detail, there's a lot of due diligence that has to go into the technical process. And as I said, the rocks, the mineralisation. So we set up a project finance team, did a lot of derivative business in the precious metals and base metal sector, came back and was invited to run back in Sydney the mining finance team for 10 years. Had some great colleagues around me. So we did project financing, construction finance for building projects in Asia and Australia. We also did the Macraes mine, which was, I think, my only involvement in New Zealand. And so I really enjoyed that for a decade. And then I joined Taurus Funds Management. We hung our shingle in about 2007. I joined about 2010. We started managing equity funds. So we would invest in mining companies that typically were completing feasibility studies, pre-feasibility, sort of going into bankable feasibility, try and ride that valuation curve, typically take 5, 10, 15% of the equity of a company, an emerging company, take a board seat. We managed 2 equity funds up until about 2012-13. There was a lot of volatility in the equity markets, particularly in commodities, during the GFC and coming out of that. And we found that most of our LPs, our investors, which typically were US endowments, high net worths, family offices, they didn't like that volatility. And so a bunch of the team came out of investment banks. And we thought, let's go back to a less volatile product, which of course is debt. So we raised our first debt fund around 2014, which is $1 billion, mainly from big US institutions, endowments, but also pension money. Pension funds that are looking for a stable return, a double-digit return. And we've recently, 3 or 4 years ago, raised our second fund, which is a $1.3 billion. So typically, we do project finance, acquisition finance. We're in precious metals, gold, silver, base metals, copper, lead, zinc, nickel, tin, cobalt, so a lot of the battery metals that we talk about. We do metallurgical coal, not thermal coal, as is the preference of our investors. So we've got a lot of exposure in Queensland's Bowen Basin, which is a big metallurgical coal province. Of course, that goes into steel, not power production. And we also do industrial minerals. So, one of the flavours of the month at the moment, particularly because of, sadly, the Ukraine war, is fertilisers, so potash and phosphate. We also do mineral sands, ilmenite, rutile, zircon. Anything from 40 million US to 250 million as a ticket, so we can compete very much with the banks. And it's a great space. Just like rugby took me all around the world, mining takes me around the world to great conferences, occasionally to mine sites. It's better for the technical guys to go to the mine sites. I don't have a lot of value, apart from, meeting communities, looking at the social, environmental, issues, which are always very critical. It's the industry's full of unique people, and so many diverse sectors. It's us lenders, it's the equity markets and the brokers, it's the geologists, it's the engineers, it's the metallurgists, it's the bankers, and then it's all the countries, and we've done a lot in Africa, particularly West Africa in the gold, the Birimian gold belt of West Africa. So just like when I was at SocGen, being a French bank, we had an appetite for Francophone countries up in West Africa, so Mali, Guinea, Burkina Faso, Ivory Coast. Sadly, there's a number of military coups in those regions, but it tends not to impact the operations, the actual mining operations. But we continue to have an appetite there. So we've done probably $1.5–2 billion of funding up in West Africa. And that's always fascinating, to go to those places. And might I just say, Stephanie, in finishing up there and what we do, one of the things I get great pleasure from is leaving legacies. People can sometimes be critical of mining and they forget that it goes into everything that we use, including, these things. And if you want to turn your lights on, if you want to open your garage, if you want to build, buy a car. But you leave a legacy, hopefully. One, rehabilitation is critical in the environmental and social impacts, but it's leaving their legacies of employing people in these third world countries. It's building schools or being a part of helping that. It's building medical clinics and all that. And so sometimes people, forget how important that is. And it's then, of course, the GDP of countries. A lot of those countries that I mentioned, mining, the income that comes from mining and the royalties, it can contribute anything from sort of 25 to 40% of the GDP of a country.
Yeah, it's a huge impact in certain regions. The ESG you mentioned, and I guess more generally, lower commodity prices have led to underinvestment over the last wee while. How do you think about that, and do you see commodity prices moving up from where we are now?
Well, it depends what commodity you're talking about. I mean, gold's come off a little bit, largely because of the global inflation that's in the market and also the strength of the US dollar. Both those things don't normally help precious metals, but you've still got gold being a defensive commodity, and particularly geopolitical issues that certainly aren't over as far as I'm concerned, sadly. Not only vis-a-vis what's happening in Eastern Europe, but also what's happening in the Asia Pacific. So I don't think the geopolitical issues, and we've just seen sort of gold bounce back, sort of 3-4% in the recent days. Base metals, yes, they've certainly come off, but they're still relatively strong. Copper's running up towards about 8,000 tonnes, and copper's the bellwether of the base metals. It goes to economic activity, particularly in China, and we've seen in China that the government will continue to stimulate. It will stay, sort of in positive growth. It might have come off from your typical 7-8% that we saw 5 and 10 years ago, but it'll still probably be 3 to 4%. The government's not going to continue to stimulate the economy, and they will be coming out of that strange policy of COVID lockdown that they've got in the not too distant future. But that government needs to get the support of their millions of people, and if you look at coal, that one of the critical things of 20 years ago, China went from a net exporter of coal to become a net importer. If you look at their steel production, back 20 years ago, they were producing as much steel as Japan has done, 100 million tonnes. Consistently, Japan has done 100 million tonnes, in the last 20 years. China was doing that 20 years ago. They're now doing 1 billion tonnes of steel production because of the way that they have continued to urbanise 1% of their population, and that requires tonnes and tonnes of iron ore, of metallurgical coal, of copper, of zinc, of lead, the electrification of everything, of silver. And so, look, it's not going away. You've got other countries in the Asia Pacific emerging and urbanising. So, look, yes, it's been a little bit down in the last couple of months, particularly over September, but it's not over. And you've got to remember, in the old days, I'm going back 30 years ago when I started in the mining industry, the thermal coal price here in Australia was stable at $20. It hardly moved from 20 Australian dollars, or it might have been US dollars, a tonne. And this will put things in perspective because of the stars aligning in relation to what's going on in Eastern Europe, but also the power crisis that you've got globally that's happening. The thermal coal price is now trading, the Newcastle thermal coal, which is a very important global benchmark from the Hunter Valley, at over $400 a tonne, which should put it in perspective. Iron ore's gone through the roof. We have a budget coming up next week, and the new Treasurer, Jim Chalmers, will be announcing that. But a couple of weeks ago, he was expected to be announcing an $80 billion deficit. All of a sudden, that's only going to be $30 billion now from recent projections because of the contribution of iron ore, coal and gas. So we're in a very strong place in Australia, despite going through COVID and lockdowns and all the government stimulus that was required. It's a great space to be, and I know Stefan, from travelling with you guys, New Zealand Funds looks to offer commodities and hedging products as diversification out of your main themes of investment, which I think will play well going forward because it's not over yet, the commodity game, I can assure you of that.
It's really interesting to talk to someone that's actually on the ground at the mines at the...
I thought you were going to say coalface.
I was about to say coalface.
You were, weren't you?
Yeah, I was. I didn't want to, but there we go. Because from a financial point of view, we invest in these commodities, and you formulate your investment thesis around demand and supply, and that research is able to be done. But I guess you forget the effects of some of these things on wider economies, like you were talking about in terms of in West Africa, and the fact that is you're basically providing them with one of their sole sources of GDP. Do you think that with coal at over $400 a tonne?
Remember, that's US too.
US, yeah, exactly. So it's just got a whole lot more expensive for a New Zealander.
When you look at where your currency and our currency is, yeah.
Do you think there's been a global mistake around ESG? Because, look, I would far rather coal wasn't burnt than burnt because of what it does to the environment. But you can't just switch off a power source and hope that we're going to sort of all transition. There has to be a transitional period. And where we find ourselves now is a lack of huge amounts of supply of not just coal, but lots of different commodities. When you look at the actual commodities coming out of the ground, are we massively underproducing a lot of these commodities still? And is there a lot more money that has to go into it to get the supply up?
I think in particular when you look at the base metals, there's no doubt about that, particularly copper, nickel. I mean, obviously lithium, which goes into the batteries and what have you, and the lack of capital that's gone into those. And of course, when I talk about copper, the biggest country is the Latin American country Chile. Now, there's geopolitical issues in those places because their governments are looking to impose increased fiscal policies, just as the Queensland government has imposed greater royalties on the coal sector, just totally out of the blue as a cash grab. So there's all these geopolitical issues that go on. As I mentioned, West Africa has got these various military coups going on. Whilst it hasn't affected operations, it impacts people like ourselves. All of a sudden we might need political risk insurance, investing now in Mali or Burkina Faso, whereas previously we wouldn't, which increases the cost of capital. So there's all these issues you've got to consider, but there's no doubt if you look at where the electric vehicle consumption is projected to go to, for example, as one sector, the current forecast production of copper, of lithium going forward, of nickel, of cobalt, there's no way it can reach the expected consumption of those metals. So what's got to happen is there's got to be more production. What has to happen to get more production? Your average operating cost, or at least the price you receive to get the margin required to get the return on the investment from shareholders, the price has to go up. So I think there's no doubt in the next 5 years, geopolitical issues and the wider economic issues coming under control, particularly inflation, you need to see higher prices in the next 5 years going forward to incentivise development of new mines. So definitely in the base metal sector, I think we'll see that. Eventually it's hard to build more mines. And to come back to your point on thermal coal plants, people forget, whilst governments, and you would know that we've just had a whole bunch of Teal MPs elected, replacing people like Josh Frydenberg in Kooyong, of all places. They're going to put pressure on closing down fossil fuels and thermal coal plants sooner rather than later. But people forget that in China, in many parts of Asia, Vietnam, Malaysia, they're still building coal-fired power plants. People forget that. China's a huge emitter of carbon dioxide, and yet they don't have to comply with all these global sort of policies that our governments sign up to and net zero by whenever you want, 20, 30, 40 or 50. And one of the things, James, when I think about thermal coal plants that are being built around the world, 3, 4, 5 years ago, I used to hear the expression HEL coal plant, which stands for high energy, low emission. Now, these are the latest technology of thermal coal plants. People forget that they're now being built to greatly reduce, as opposed to 20, 30, 40 years ago, the emissions that thermal coal plants would put out. And so there's a vast change in technology that we never talk about anymore. And when people talk about closing down the Hunter Valley, which was a huge employer of people, 100,000 people with the add-on jobs, and it's a huge employer of people, and of course contributes enormously to the royalties and the corporate taxes of Australia and New South Wales. People forget again that this is the best quality coal in the world. It's 6,000 kilocalories. And what does that mean, as opposed to the Indonesian coal, which might be 4,000 kilocalories, or the Victorian coal, which is the lignite brown coal, or the Indian coal? That's the alternative you use if you close down this massive 170 million tonne Hunter Valley coal industry. So, your alternative is you use the crap coal that comes out of Indonesia that produces far more emissions in the Chinese and the Vietnam plants, or you continue to use the best coal in the world, which will lower emissions anyway. And so these are some of the conundrums we have when trying to write off the coal industry, particularly in Australia.
And so when you forecast, first question, how long out of interest does it take to get a mine up and running? And there's probably such a generic question depending on the commodity.
No, it's not necessary, James, because you've got to look at all the different jurisdictions, and it can be quite different between New South Wales and Victoria and Queensland, because one of the critical things is permitting. And so that's typically state governments, and permitting can vary hugely between regions, and can in other countries as well. And some countries are quite anti-coal. When you go to a lot of these emerging countries, you've got to get the communities on board, which means that they have to enjoy some fiscal benefits, and you've got to employ the people, and you've got to leave legacies for the communities, and you've got to tell them you're going to build the project, operate the project, and then rehabilitate the project in a sensible social way. And so people have to see that they benefit. And so it varies from state to state, from province to province, from country to country, and also fiscal policies that attract investment. So to answer your question, a typical mine from exploration and discovery will typically take at least a decade to get up. Your exploration phase is often 3 to 5 years. Pre-feasibility study stage, so you've got an economic project based on sound and sensible forecasts and commodity prices of how much it's going to cost to build your project and what's your life of mine, etc. That'll take you another 2 or 3 years. Going into definitive feasibility study stage will take you at least another year or 18 months. And through that last process, you're looking to get permitting. So it's anything from 10 to 15 years. And then, of course, as you go towards into definitive feasibility, you're looking at the financing of it, which is often, raising equity, typically 50-50 equity debt, but then going out to the banks. And the banks, here in Australia won't do West Africa. The European banks will do it, like my old bank, SocGen, or the alternative financiers like ourselves. And there's a lot of them now, but it's getting the right mix of debt and equity and getting, the right terms that allow your project to be economic. And there's a lot of work that goes into it. It's a bit like the rugby when I talked about the blood, sweat and tears. But 10 to 15 years would be a typical period cycle to take a project from exploration success. And remember, a lot of projects don't get exploration success. That's why we have so many junior companies on the ASX, on the TSX, the Toronto Stock Exchange, the LME, and the Johannesburg Stock Exchange. Typically.
I mean, what that shows to me is that as some of these metals become more prevalent, as in they've been, copper, aluminium, even lithium, silver, they've been around a long time, but their usage is going to massively increase because of decarbonisation, because of electric cars, etc. I mean,
absolutely, James. And you've got to remember too, every house that builds has got so much more electrification than the houses that were built 10, 20, 30 years ago.
And it takes 15 years to get the supply.
And silver, absolutely.
At best. Yeah.
And we know the inflationary impact on building a house now. You guys have experienced in New Zealand, we have. It's the supply chain that goes into the materials, forgetting about how difficult it is to get labour now.
I mean, the simple conclusion is commodity prices have to go up to encourage this investment if we want to decarbonise, and we have to get used to that fact that inflation around some of these products is going to be, house building isn't going to come down anytime soon. Maybe from a labour point of view, perhaps as wages go up and down, but from a materials point of view for cars and house building and construction, it's...
Yeah, James, you're going to have blips, and we're having a bit of a blip now because I think the world is quite uncertain about how quickly inflation can come down, and that fine balance between central banks controlling inflation, putting their foot on the brake of growth, but tipping their countries or their regions into recession. We all know that, and our central banks, yours and ours, are critically aware of that, and that's why I think we just saw earlier this week in Australia 0.25% as opposed to the predicted 0.5%, which I think is wise because there's the lag impact of the rising interest rates. But there's that fine balance. But the commodity market and commodity prices came roaring out of the great financial crisis that we had in 2008 and 9. We saw record prices in 10, 11, etc. So, the consumption, global consumption, and particularly out of critical countries like China, with that 1% of urbanising their population as they've been doing for the last over 20 years, is a critical part of that.
Another thought is that for coal, the key alternative is obviously nuclear, and the time between starting a nuclear project and getting that up and running isn't 15 years, it's 25 years. So you've got a longer window before you actually can, find that and put that in.
Yeah, and all that due diligence and permitting that goes into it, let alone, getting the politicians to come on board. I mean, I was lucky enough to have breakfast with the opposition leader this morning, Peter Dutton, in a group with Ord Minnett. And we talked a lot about nuclear power, and, I've always been a huge supporter of that. I lived in Paris when I joined Société Générale for 4 years. France typically produces 80% of their power, just as you guys are gifted to be able to produce 90% of your power from hydro. But France have been doing it, and they bid for, the towns bid for building a nuclear power plant in their country, and yet here we are in Australia, 2/3 of all uranium resources. As Bob Hawke, unbelievably, as Prime Minister, sort of, started to talk about probably 35 years ago. Not only should we be building nuclear module plants, because of our resources, because of our stable country as far as structure, but we also should be considering being a repository of the world's waste, which would be a huge economic benefit to our country, because unlike your country, we've got a very stable structures. We could bury it deep in the ground. We've got a massive continent. And that's something that we seriously, I think, should look at, as well as nuclear generation, because at the end of the day, what we need is reliable and affordable power. And it's not going to happen. We're about a week away from, as records have stood for, I think, 160 years in this country, of this being our wettest year. And, you can look out over my shoulder, you're not going to see a lot of the harbour, because again, it's one of those cold, wet, windy days. And when the wind doesn't blow, well, actually it is blowing, but when the sun doesn't shine, all that solar out there in the vast continent of Australia doesn't produce a lot of affordable and reliable
I bet
energy.
Germany is wishing they weren't so reliant on other countries for their energy and had made that decision.
Huge mistake, just relying on that Russian gas. We all know that. It's easy in retrospect, but even Donald Trump was saying it 3 years ago.
Oh yeah, I said those words the other day too. He may have said it in a controversial way, but what he was saying was absolutely right. Why would you rely on countries such as Russia for your energy supply? It's just absolute madness.
Absolutely.
Last question from me, Nick. How do you think about the relationship between New Zealand and Australia, and where to from here?
Oh, Stephen, I think we've always been very close, and that's great. And, again, I go back to the third half, when it's sport. Sometimes, in corporate life, it's damn the torpedoes full speed ahead, flat out. But we've got a great relationship. I was lucky enough to go up for the centenary of Gallipoli to Istanbul, and then on to the peninsula for the centenary of Anzac Day, 2015. And, there are a lot of Kiwis up there as well as Aussies. And, I think that Anzac relationship will always cement our relationship, fighting together, supporting each other, defending, along with Europe, our allies. And to me, that's the thing that binds us together, connects us by the umbilical cord. We compete against each other really hard, which is great, and we also come together, and sort of support each other when efficiencies, sort of make it sensible. But we're always going to have a great relationship. It'll be a love-hate relationship, but I think it's that ultimate looking at each other, just as we have that great relationship with the United States, as do you and Great Britain. It's the importance of that relationship and coming together at critical times to support each other. And, we're the big brother, I'd like to say, at least as far as population and the size of our country. And I'd like to think that, if required, from any sort of defensive perspective, or any area where we can add value, that we always will. And I have no doubt that that would be the case. But at the same time, you guys lead in other areas and, you know, not just sport. You know, look at Fonterra, for example. It's a global leader in milk products and also your fruits. And we import a lot of things from you guys, your timber, which is so critical and one of the reasons why we've been struggling in residential building, because during COVID, there were those supply constraints and what have you. But we're always going to be close. It's that ultimate Anzac bond that will continue to bind us and give us that lasting relationship, which I have no doubt will go forward.
This has been the Monday Call, brought to you by NZ Funds. New Zealand Funds Management Limited is the issuer of the NZ Funds KiwiSaver scheme, the NZ Funds Managed Superannuation Service, the NZ Funds Advised Portfolio Service, the NZ Funds Wealth Builder, and NZ Funds Income Generator. A product disclosure statement for each is available at nzfunds.co.nz. Past performance is not necessarily an indicator of future returns.